Hi, just going to go through an overview for those of you that manage buildings 11 to 18 meters and 18 meter plus in terms of new legislation and the requirements for managing agents and property managers in relation to safety on these buildings. So the Grenfell Tower incident happened in 2017. That cost 76 people their lives and injured 70 more. It's the largest loss of life in any fire in the UK since 1988. Following that incident, Dame Judith Hackett made a report which concluded that the existing regulatory system for high-rise buildings was not fit for purpose. So there were a large number of recommendations that came out of that report, and we are now starting to see them come to fruition. The first being Fire Safety Act of 2021, which is an update to the previous Fire Safety Order of 2005, and more recently, the Building Safety Act of 2022. So the biggest changes for managing agents are a requirement to create a building safety case for high-risk buildings. So that's 18 meter plus, especially where there are combustible materials or defects, and the creation of a golden thread of information for each high-risk building. So that will include all documentation in terms of asset management, service records, materials present, escape routes, fire risk actions, and that will all be compiled in a set format, which will be the golden thread of information from start to finish on how a building is structured and how it's maintained. There is also the need for fire door inspections in all buildings of 2 or more units, and that is being brought in now and will be effective January 2023. So that relates to buildings where there are 2 or more units that have sleep-in accommodation. So that is essentially anything that we manage that has got shared areas, whether you've got 2 flats or 100 flats, the same applies. So how do we identify relevant defects and who will pay for those? So MHCLG, which was the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, is now the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities. So they are the government department which is responsible for building safety. So they have now formally withdrawn the Consolidated Advice Note of January 2020. So to briefly explain what that was, following Grenfell, 18 meter plus buildings were required to be assessed to confirm, firstly, whether they had ACM cladding, and there was a fund made available for that. Following the ACM fund, the scope was then extended to all combustible materials on buildings 18 meters and above. In January 2020, they extended that advice again to bring all buildings into the scope of EWS1, regardless of the height. Now, as most property managers will know, there are some buildings where a survey simply isn't required, where they're small, low-risk buildings, and that is the reason that the Consolidated Advice Note January 2020 was withdrawn, based on the fact that below 11 meters, there isn't seen to be a widespread risk of fire spread, and therefore they withdrew that in January of 2022. So there remains prohibition on combustible materials being installed on 18 meter plus buildings. That is current, so you won't be able to build anything installing these materials at the moment. So developers will be finding that they have to change the specifications so that building control would sign these buildings off. In some cases they haven't, and that's why we've ended up having to remediate through the fund. So that ban is still in place on combustible materials 18 meters and above, but they have brought in a new methodology to assess the genuine risk level across the building, and that is what's known as PAS 9980 or 9980. So PAS essentially stands for Publicly Available Specification. So that is a central document that all risk assessors, fire engineers, property managers can access online. It's a lengthy document, but it basically explains the methodology and the guidance for how to carry out a survey of the external wall system. So the latest version of that, 9980, is the approved methodology for reviewing buildings of all height to take into account their external wall systems. We also use PAS 79, which is the guidance methodology for a type 1 fire risk assessment, so your usual fire risk assessment of the common parts. So you will see them referred to as external wall surveys, PAS 9980 surveys, or FRAEW, so fire risk assessment of the external wall. And again, the Fire Safety Act of 2021 made this a legal requirement on all buildings of 2 or more units if the fire risk assessor recommends it. So that is, you have your type 1 fire risk assessment, Cardenas or whoever that might be. That risk assessor on the day will note whether there is any evidence of any cladding or any concerns around attachments or the external wall system. So the Fire Safety Act brings into scope doors, windows, balconies, the materials that are on the wall, but also it brings into scope the location and the configuration of those wall systems. So for a brief example, you might have timber balconies, but they might be dotted across the building rather than one on top of another, what we call stacked balconies. And in those cases, they might say, okay, the material is combustible, that's high risk, but where they are located in relation to the rest of the building means that they are suitably low risk and therefore they won't have any remediation required. With the previous guidance, that would have been black and white. Are they combustible? Yes, they must come out. So the PAS is a more holistic approach to look at fire safety and to assess whether or not any combustible materials that are present would actually contribute to external fire spread. So Centrick are engaged with a number of providers in terms of the external wall risk assessments, and the aim of that is to try to limit the cost to leaseholders. So we've had a couple of firms that we've been working with for some time now, and obviously as we come down from 18 metre to 11 metre and below, the unit counts within these properties and within the service charge get lower and lower, and therefore the contributions get higher. So in order for us to make sure that we're giving reasonable costs that we can bill through the service charge, we've approached a number of companies and we'll be putting together a matrix of what that will look like on a block by block basis so that we can arrange surveys as and when they're recommended in your fire risk assessment. So they are required under the Fire Safety Act 2021 only if your fire risk assessment asks for one. Your fire risk assessor might well say the building is clearly masonry, it predates 1970, so these materials weren't around then. So in those cases, you won't need to take any further action on the external wall if your risk assessor has already agreed that the building is safe. At the moment, we can still continue to bill these surveys as a professional fee through the service charge that's not affected as it stands by the Building Safety Act. On to the waterfall system and options for funding on 18 metre or above buildings. So if your building is over 18 metres, typically 6 stories and higher, or 17.7 metres to the floor level of the top habitable floor, there is different options available right now that aren't available for 11 to 18 metre buildings. So the measurement for 17.7 is a requirement by the Building Safety Fund. It's very loosely based on the old height that fire brigades used to be able to reach. So although it doesn't hold much relevance these days in high-rise buildings, that is where the government and relevant building safety groups have identified there is a risk to life on these higher risk buildings, if you like. So 17.7 meters to the top floor level of the top habitable floor. So the apartment on the top floor, not the roof of the top apartment, not including plant rooms. Your measurement needs to be from the ground to the slab level of your top floor to qualify. So the Building Safety Fund is reopened, originally opened in 2020. Centrick registered all of our high-rise stock at that time for the Building Safety Fund in anticipation of facade surveys coming back with problems. Many of those came back to tell us actually sufficiently low risk, or that they were outside of the height bracket to be included in the fund. So the fund is now reopened for people that didn't apply because they didn't have surveys in place originally, or for people that have since discovered defects. So the fund opened in August of 2022. This time around, all applications need to be supported by a PAS 9980 survey. And the reason for that is the previous guidance was very black and white. Are there combustible materials? Yes. Do they need to come out? Are they a risk? Yes. That was the criteria. You had to have certain materials and they had to be recommended for removal. Now that we're using the new guidance, there's potential that your fire engineer, your risk assessor will carry out PAS 9980 survey, and they might recommend a smaller scope of works. So some very crude examples, we might have stacked timber balconies, one on top of the other, and under a PAS guidance, the fire risk assessor might say something as simple as, if you changed every other balcony, that means that the risk comes down low enough that you don't need to remediate the others. So that's the reason that they've included PAS 9980 in the current fund. So they will be addressing all life critical fire safety issues highlighted in the PAS, or the fire risk assessment of the external wall. So that is a bit beyond the original building safety scope. So the fund previously refused to pay for balconies, they wouldn't pay for mitigation like fire alarms, that kind of stuff, although there was separate funds opened up for that. The indication from DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up, at the moment is if your fire engineer recommends work within the PAS 9980 survey, and that would have been outside of scope last time round. So we're talking about a facade that is otherwise compliant, might be no combustible materials, but it's missing cavity barriers. If they are certified in the PAS survey by the fire engineer to say that they are a life critical fire safety issue, the Building Safety Fund this time around will consider those to be funded. So the first port of call when we're notified of a relevant defect is obviously make the client aware, liaise with the compliance team, but we need to be pursuing developers and the warranty providers as far as reasonably possible. So if you know that your developer is still active, if they're on company's house, if they haven't gone away, the Building Safety Act says that they must pay for the work. Now they don't have to. There is plans in place for the government to force them to come back, but that's yet to be legislated. So there are 48 that have currently volunteered to come back and fix their buildings. There's a list of those available. If you've got a building that is constructed by one of these firms that have already pledged, then that's great news. You should be looking to get PAS 9980 survey completed, get that over to the developer and say to them, this is what our fire engineer has recommended as a remedy. We're going to arrange for this to be done and you will get the bill, or you need to agree to take on the contract for the works yourselves. And the same goes for warranties. They're going to be asking for PAS survey as well now, just because the landscape has shifted slightly. So in terms of the waterfall system, it goes developer must pay. If the developer isn't around, then the building owner would be liable for all of the costs of remediation. Building owners have an additional option where they can evidence that they can't afford or they don't meet the threshold of affordability. And right now, that is 2 million of net asset or net worth per affected building, and that is across their group. So if you had a string of companies, Centrick is one example, you got Centrick Limited, Centrick Sales and Lettings, as a group, if you don't have 2 million net assets per affected building, so 10 buildings, 20 million, then you won't have to pay for these works as the building owner. So building owners, freehold clients are looking into their liability at the moment. Most of these companies are set up as SPVs or investment asset holding companies, so they don't actually carry a great deal of sort of income and wealth attached to them. They are really just companies that exist for the purpose of processing the ground rent, etc. So it is unlikely that too many of our clients will meet that threshold and have to pay, but that is one that they're working through at the moment. The building owner will need to certify that so that we can evidence to leaseholders. This is why you're going to have to pay some costs, because it's trickling down, because our building owner has confirmed via a certificate that they don't meet the threshold and therefore they can't pay. So they will, in those cases, then need a contribution order, which is essentially a notice served on the leaseholders to say we've found some relevant defects, we've gone to the developer, they're not around, either the Building Safety Fund has rejected us or we don't meet the threshold, and the next option is that we pass that cost down to leaseholders. So building owners are working on that, and we are working with them at the moment to try and understand where they might have some liability. So works that are not relevant defects is things like wear and tear, no fault defects, regular building maintenance. They are subject to the service charge as usual. They can be passed through by Section 20. We're only dealing with relevant defects, something that was not correct at the time of build or has since been found to be defective. We're not talking about the roof has not been serviced or not been cleaned for 10 years. Those kind of things we can't pass back to the developer. We're talking about life critical fire safety issues. So compartmentation, if it wasn't done properly, yes, the developer, if they're around, should be coming back to rectify that. But we need to establish if that is developer's fault or if it's been 15 years and various people have gone in and out and gone through the fire stopping, installing various services. If it's a genuine fault, then yes, we can try to pass that back to the developer. As we've just discussed on 18-metre buildings, very similar setup in terms of the waterfall system. The exception being right now, there is no building safety fund for anything below 18 metres. So 11 to 18 metres, mid-rise buildings, 5 stories and above by definition from the fund and the Building Safety Act. But obviously we will have buildings that may have one section that is 5 stories and above, the rest of the building might be smaller, there might be a number of blocks and one of them meets the threshold, the rest might be smaller. So we need to take it on a building by building, block by block basis. So as per the Building Safety Act, developers must fix buildings that they had a part in constructing. If the developer has pledged voluntarily, they're going to need a PAS survey, and very possibly they're going to want a Type 4 invasive fire risk assessment. A Type 4 fire risk assessment is essentially going through the walls inside the building from the apartment into the common parts to see whether or not the fire protection in there is adequate so that the unit, the apartment, would contain fire for the required period of time, normally 60 minutes. So the idea behind instructing a Type 4 risk assessment as well is because these developers have pledged to come back. They only want to do it once. They want to be sure that everything is wrapped up and there's no sort of comebacks further down the line. So they would probably be asking for PAS 9980 and a Type 4 risk assessment. That will give you a list of all the defects that can go to the developer and say, this is what you need to come back and fix. The developer will then pledge to fix that. If your developer is not willing to return or is no longer an active company, which is the case in a lot of these buildings, mainly because the companies are set up purely for the purpose of construction on that building, they then sell the freehold and fold the special purpose vehicle, the company, the shell company that was set up. So there is some talk from government that they will be looking to identify developers who've used that process and sort of hidden behind other companies. If they can be linked directly to an existing company, the government may still try to pursue them down that avenue. We can pursue them to an extent, but we don't want to start burdening leaseholders with legal costs, which potentially we might never recover. If the developer won't return or is no longer active, then we're back to the waterfall system discussed earlier in terms of the building owner must pay. If they can't afford it, then they must certify that they can't afford it, and we can then look at recharging to leaseholders. So the leaseholder protections that come in with the Building Safety Act, which I'm sure you've all had comments from various leaseholders who now believe that they don't ever have to pay anything ever again for fire safety. It is not the case. So the leaseholder must be a qualifying leaseholder. So very broadly, this means that the property must be their main home and that they do not own more than 3 properties in England and Wales. That includes houses. So if we had a scenario where you have an investor who's got 3 properties in Birmingham city centre, but they live in a house in North Wales, they won't qualify as qualifying leaseholder on those properties. If you've got an owner-occupier who has got less than 3 properties, then they will qualify for all 3. If you've got somebody who owns 1 property and they live in it, then they will qualify. So the caveat for qualifying leaseholders is fairly simple. Are you a buy-to-rent investor with more than 3 properties? If you are, then unless you live in one of those as your main home, you're not going to be protected from any service charges. Those that are protected under the Building Safety Act, there is a cap in place at £10,000. Now, the cap is dependent on the value of the apartment. The buildings that we're talking about almost always are going to be capped at 10k. There are some exceptions. If the apartment is worth between 375,000 to £1 million, then the cap is lifted, I think, to £50,000. But at the moment, right now, the apartments that we're dealing with, there aren't too many that are in the £400,000 plus bracket in terms of individual apartment costs. That may well change, and we'll review that as and when those sort of buildings come in. So it is anticipated that there will be a levy in place on home builders, so developers who are building apartment blocks, and that will raise additional revenue. So the government are talking about another 4 billion to be put through in funding, and we understand that it is earmarked to become a new fund for 11 to 18 metre buildings. So we don't want to be in a position where we steamroll ahead and get works done and then funding appears that we could have had, but also we don't want to be sitting on the risk on these buildings where we know something is wrong and we're not doing anything about it. But our case is strengthened by the fact that we now know who we can go to and we can pick off those developer, building owner, leaseholder, and we can evidence that we've tried to remediate the building as best we can. If there's no funding available, then obviously we need to continue to lobby government for them to make decisions on how that's going to be funded. So the cap on leaseholders, it does apply to any costs incurred in the last 5 years. So our service charge accounts team will be working with PMs and with us to unpick any invoices that are related to relevant defects in the last 5 years, and we'll then be able to calculate based on the apportionment how much people have already contributed. So that will limit the amount that we can then pass on to those leaseholders, because some people may have paid £5,000 already. That means we can still bill them £5,000 if they are a qualifying leaseholder. It'll remain to be seen how each unit itself has their costs apportioned. And again, similar to the building owners, the leaseholder will need to produce a certificate to confirm that they are a qualifying leaseholder, and we would then need to notify them of how much we have charged them to date so that we can allocate what is left to be billed to them if needed. So there's no automatic refund, but we will need to check anyone who has paid in excess of the 10k cap already. I would imagine there are a couple out there, but it's seemingly going to be very rare. So that is how the Building Safety Act looks at the moment in terms of how we can bill, who is protected, and it is going to be very much case by case because each building is different. Now, the challenges for property managers and service charge accountants, which are pretty significant in terms of how our business operates and how we then service these additional requirements that have been put on us through the cladding crisis, scandal, call it what you will, and the changes to legislation that effectively take away our ability to plan a project, bill it through the usual Section 20 process, and make our occupants safe. So that has put another barrier that we need to now navigate. And here's how we're going to try and approach that. So as mentioned earlier, clients are reviewing their liability on a building by building basis. There will be some where the building owner meets that cap and they will have to either pay in full or contribute to those works. Relevant defects, as discussed, a relevant defect being something that was wrong at the time of construction or has since been found to be wrong and poses life-critical fire safety issues to the building or the structure of the building. They now cannot be billed to the service charge unless we have reviewed that and the 10k cap hasn't been hit, and that is effective from the end of June. So it does cause some problems for us where we've issued July 1st demands. We looked at those demands that were going out and we don't feel that any went out where relevant defects are being billed. So stuff that's been billed to date, there's nothing we can do about it. We don't have to refund it immediately. We go through the process of what they've been charged in the last 5 years. The trigger for that is if a leaseholder requests it, but we will look to collate all of that information over the next few weeks and months. So the clients are going to want to know all the related costs for relevant defects that we've billed in the last 5 years. And that includes waking watch, facade surveys, and remediation. So even if we've had a building safety application, if we've also billed some of the ineligible costs, or we've billed waking watch or interim measures like fire alarms to the service charge, we need to calculate those over the last 5 years and work out how much each unit has contributed. So contributions to relevant defects will need to be calculated so we can make sure then that freeholders aren't in breach of the law under the Building Safety Act for qualifying leaseholders. So the legislation mentioned above here, effective June 2022, makes it a criminal offence to issue a service charge demand for relevant defects if we haven't verified that they are a qualifying leaseholder and it's within the cap and we're able to bill that out. That isn't helped by the fact that a letter went out from government, which was widely available. It didn't consider cases where the building owner can't afford to remediate. So there are cases where we genuinely can pass on charges through the service charges. We just need to make sure that they are all legal and correct before we're issuing them. There's a lot of confusion out there from leaseholders, and I'm sure property managers as well, as to whether we can build anything, how we possibly make these buildings safe without funding. And those are things that will sort of come to light over the next few months. But from the end of June 22, if a leaseholder's already paid £10,000 and we send them a bill, we're potentially putting our client and ourselves at risk there for breaches under the Building Safety Act 2022. Now, the fire authorities, so your fire and rescue services, West Midlands Fire predominantly, we're also now dealing with more authorities. We've got Manchester, we've got sites with London Fire Brigade. We're now branching out to Kent and to the south coast. So we're dealing with more and more brigades, and their guidance is the Regulatory Reform Order, Fire Safety Order of 2005, which essentially says those people responsible for communal areas of a building have a duty to ensure that the occupants are safe at all times, which is why we have our fire alarm checks and services. All the Fire Safety Act 2021 does is update that to say, okay, this is the buildings it applies to. So it now applies to anything 2 units or more. And these are the additional measures, and the additional measure that we need to be concerned with is fire door surveys. So the apartment doors now form part of the fire protection of the building. Although they're not ours to fix, we need to identify or certify that they're okay. And what this means in general is that the fire authorities are not aligned with the Building Safety Act. So if you speak to a fire officer who says you've got relevant defects on your building and people aren't safe, they're not really too concerned that the government have now brought in the Building Safety Act, which stops us charging leaseholders. They're concerned with how, why, and when are we going to make these buildings safe. So that's another barrier that we face. So to my mind, and where I need assistance from property managers in particular, is that we need to be able to evidence that we're reviewing the risk, we're managing it, and that we've taken all reasonable steps to get to the point that we're at, and we can justify our position. So if we've had a building where we've had a survey, there's no funding available, we know that there's additional risk, and the fire brigade are suggesting maybe an enforcement notice or deficiencies notice that we need to act on, unless we're evidencing that we're reviewing that risk and we're doing what we can about it, i.e. getting the quotes in place, reviewing the fire risk assessment, looking at what measures we can take to limit the risk, then the fire authorities are going to press ahead and they're going to give us enforcement notices. And in the worst cases, we're going to end up with prohibition notices where the building is not fit to be occupied, where there are significant breaches of fire safety. And that isn't aligned with the Building Safety Act. So Building Safety Act has taken away our Section 20, which was our tool to be able to get these jobs done by billing it out, making sure it's safe. Yes, there's a horrible conversation to have with leaseholders because they've got to pay, but hey, at least they're safe and we've removed that risk. Now that we can't do that, it's even more important that we're dealing with the fire risk assessment actions and anything else that will support us in approaching the fire officer and saying, here's where we're at, this is why we can't move forward, this is the timescale that we expect. So Centrick, other agents, clients, people that we're working with are all sitting regularly with Armour and the Building Safety Group, and we are pushing for further clarity on what the funding might look like for 11 to 18 metre buildings. It's a slow process. You've probably seen notes from Armour or the Property Institute, as they are now, asking for clarity. A good example is the Waking Watch Relief Fund. We recommended that as soon as we found out Waking Watch was going to be required on some buildings 2 years ago. It took them 8 months to bring that in. When they brought it in, the people that had already gone ahead and put a fire alarm in weren't eligible. So we are stuck walking this tightrope between managing the fire risk of the building, not being able to bill it to service charge, and trying to protect leaseholders from the cost. So obviously I am more concerned about ensuring that the building itself is safe. But the government have gone ahead and prevented us from charging that to service charge. So the Wake and Watch Relief Fund is there if you get a worst case scenario 18 metre plus, but it isn't there in the rare occasion that you might be asked to put a Wake and Watch on under 18 metres. So we continue to push, and anytime we get an update from Armour or from the Department for Levelling Up, we will push those out to property managers just so you can see where we're making progress, and we'll have regular communications with leaseholders. So the final point on the challenges that we face is the insurance market. Again, they're being lobbied because their risk to life and property risk are linked together. If a fire engineer says fire spread risk is low, then the insurer should accept that fire won't spread externally and there isn't an increased risk there. But that is not the message that we're getting from the insurance market. If anything, there is a reluctance to place cover on any of these buildings. And that is an issue that isn't tackled in the Building Safety Act. There is no funding for it. It can be billed as part of the service charge. There's no cap on it, and there'll be no reimbursements for increased insurance at this time. Now, Centrick's approach for 2022 to 23 and beyond is to extend the information that we've got to the wider business and to bring property managers into what's happening on their buildings at a higher level in terms of safety, consultants, fire brigades, all of that sort of stuff. So far, the compliance team have handled most of the building safety applications from start to finish, the warranty claims and client liaisons in relation to the cladding and the major defects. On some of the more critical schemes, PMs are heavily involved. They're doing a lot of the comms, they're dealing with all of those inquiries, and that is taking up an awful lot of time from property managers to PAs to the compliance team. There's a lot of information sort of swimming about in various parties, and the leaseholders need to be updated en masse regularly to try and deflect the number of individual inquiries. So if you've got a building of 300 units and it's got cladding issues, there's a potential there for all 300 to contact Centrick at one point or another asking for an update. We need to be ahead of that, pushing out the updates, letting them know the timescales and matching those timescales so that we can limit the number of calls that come in, the number of emails that come in, and give you guys back some time. So it's apparent to me, having juggled a number of building safety applications for the last year or so, that the information we hold, certainly within my team, is available. It's out there, it's in various systems, but it needs to be more available to the PMs, the PAs, and the wider business. So it affects sales. We've got a sales team who obviously are trying to sell leasehold properties, and they need to know whether or not their buyer is going to have any bills to pay in relation to relevant defects or cladding. They're going to want to know if the EWS1 is adequate, whether they can market or sell at all. Same for freehold sales, buy to rent, build to rent investors, and to an extent our lettings team as well, because if we manage the building and we also put a tenant in there, they're going to want to know that they're safe and what's being done about it. PAs and the pre-sales team are being asked to provide thorough updates on the status and progress of these projects. Where we have, as I mentioned just a moment ago, one leaseholder that's selling, they might come to the pre-sales team and ask for an update. That might be provided as a one-off. Yeah, tell them this is the status. They're then given that information, but the other 200 apartments in that building haven't had that same update at that point in time. And what we need to do is consolidate those updates. So rather than send out 50 or 100 emails to different people, let's group it all together, get everything out so that the building as a whole, occupants and stakeholders, are all up to date on what's happening. And most importantly, giving them realistic timescales for when things are likely to be done. My intention is to engage PMs on a site-by-site basis and create a matrix across our portfolio. So it'll be 18 meter plus as the priority, then 11 to 18 meters, and then we'll sweep up the rest on these smaller buildings, which hopefully we shouldn't have too many of with relevant defects. So we want to have shared trackers. We want to try and apply as best as possible scenarios specific to a site, the likely outcomes and the progress, as I mentioned. So it's not possible for us to say, you've got this material, therefore your timeline looks like this, because every building is different. But we will give them a general overview on why they are in that situation, what legislation, what materials have led to it, what needs to happen, how it's going to happen, who may or may not pay for it, and what the timescales are for those. And I'm intending to set up meetings with PMs with affected buildings, with their ops managers ideally, with their PA, with the rest of the compliance team, to make sure that all the information we've got, things that are coming in from fire engineers, things that are coming in from leaseholders, from insurers, from warranty providers, from clients, make sure that all of that information is consolidated, is in one place where we can all have sight of it, and the update then is uniform. So we're almost trying to build a tracker where the most recent comment is up to date and accurate, and that can be copied and pasted as a response to people that make those inquiries. But what I would prefer to see is those updates going out as portal postings before we get the inquiries to really head it off. So the first stage is going to be to review all buildings. Our stock has increased massively, especially in relation to cladding, which is good news because it means that our clients have trust in us and our ability to fix these problems. But we will need to provide a timeline for each, starting with the 18 meter plus. Okay, what happened? What are your options? What materials need to come off? What's happened with the legislation in the background? And what are your next steps? So we will be setting up regular time slots. So it's probably going to be one morning and one afternoon a week with myself or with the wider compliance team, with ops managers, with PMs, and to an extent with PAs. I'll get them in the diary and you'll be able to book those sessions, and we will run through whichever high risk buildings you have got. We'll create the timeline and then we'll consolidate that information into a company-wide update so that we can all track it from one place. The guys that were on the call when we originally ran this session had some potential ideas for how that might look. If you can think of a way that you want it presented that's going to help you, by all means reach out to us and we will try to work on that. Although I need to have the oversight of the whole thing, I am not running exactly how it's going to look. If how it looks doesn't work for you guys, then please let me know so that it's a snapshot that we can all have access to and keep everybody up to date. So property managers are the responsible person for their buildings. They always have been. It's just the spotlight has shifted slightly. Centrick are the responsible person at a corporate level. So as I mentioned earlier, it is critical now, particularly where you've got relevant defects or fire safety, life critical defects, that all your other FRA actions are being done. You know, we might have an argument with a fire officer about there's a minor patch of cladding or there's some timber balconies, but if we can show them the fire alarm's been tested every week with no problems, the escape routes are all clear, there's fire extinguishers, there's whatever it is in that risk assessment, the signage is in place, the fire action notice is accurate, all of that supports our case and allows us to engage with the fire authorities in advance, and it will limit the number of deficiencies noticed or enforcement or even prohibition notices. If we are not completing the FRA actions in time, it's very unlikely that fire officer is going to say, okay, great, I'll extend this notice by 3 or 6 months, because there's evidence there that we're clearly not managing that risk. So that is where we are at right now. That is the approach I would like to see from you guys. If you've got any questions, please flag them to me, and then I will send out invites for everybody to join these sessions and we'll go through your portfolio and get things on track. Thanks.